Conversation with North Carolina's Attorney General, Josh Stein. Next.
Major funding for Front Row is provided by Robert L. Luddy. Additional funding provided by funding for the lightning round provided by Reifenberg Construction, Stephen Gleason, and Jane and Van Hip. A complete list of funders can be found at unctv.org/Front Row.
It's Front Row with host Marc Rotterman.
Welcome back to Front Row, Mr. Attorney General.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Mark.
Why don't we begin with the antitrust lawsuit you're bringing against Facebook?
Yeah, look, the internet is so central to all of our lives, and that has only become more so during the pandemic. And when you can't go be with people face to face, being with them on social networking sites like Facebook, which is pretty much the dominant player, becomes all the more important. And what I'm concerned about is that Facebook is a monopoly, but they're using that size, using that power to hurt competitors, to put them out of business. They either buy them, which they did with Instagram and WhatsApp, or they bury them. They just make it so that they can't access the network. And as a result, consumers lose. The quality of Facebook has diminished. The privacy protections are worse. There's more junk on your news feed, advertisements. There are more fake accounts. All of these things degrade the quality. And what we need is competition so that people can go to the social networking site and be with their parents and their friends and their grandparents and their classmates and all that which social networking provides, but have it be an experience that they really enjoy. And that's all we will. We want competition. I'm not looking to put Facebook out of business. I want Facebook to succeed and thrive, but I want there to be competition.
So there's 48 other attorney generals joining you on this, sir?
And the FTC. So this is a bipartisan effort, and it's both state and federal. This is something that we all agree on, that this big tech company simply wields too much power to the detriment of its users. And we want there to be competition, we want there to be innovation so that consumers win.
Are they a monopoly in your view?
They are a monopoly. They are the exclusive social networking site that brings together friends and family.
I want to talk to you about the criminal justice reform that you're doing, racial equity. Talk to us about that a little bit and your recommendations that might be coming forward.
Absolutely. This was a task force that Governor Cooper put together in June, and it was in the wake of the killing of George Floyd up in Minnesota and all the public protests that resulted. And there was so much energy around trying to make our criminal justice system better, and we need to harness that energy and move forward, because North Carolina, really, we have a dual legacy. We have a legacy which is worthy of shame, all the racism and Jim Crow and segregation, but we also have a legacy of reform. And what's great about it, Mark, is it's been bipartisan reform. Criminal justice is one of those issues where, one of the few issues, frankly, where the Democrats and Republicans have been able to come together and try to make things better for more people. And that's what the task force is. We are 24 people. The governor selected us, and we represent the full range of stakeholders, from sheriffs, chiefs of police, and prosecutors to justice-involved individuals, criminal justice reform folks, and then we've got county commissioners and mayors. Really, all stakeholders are represented, and our agenda is to make our criminal justice system work better and treat everyone more fairly. We are making over 100 recommendations. Some of those recommendations are directed towards law enforcement agencies that they can implement. Others are to the Criminal Justice Training and Standards Commission, which is part of the Department of Justice and sets the standards for law enforcement. And then some are to the courts, and then, of course, some are to the legislature for change of law. And we've looked at the criminal justice system as an entirety, identified ways in which there are disparities, ways in which it can be improved, and those are the recommendations we're making. Use
of force is part of that. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it starts, I mean, that's what triggered this whole crisis, was that officer in Minnesota choking George Floyd to death with his knee. So there is a recommendation about banning chokeholds. There is a recommendation that when officers see another officer using excessive force, to intervene to save that person and to report it to their supervisors. So those are definitely in the report, but it's so much broader. It goes from recruiting and training officers, getting the best and brightest, paying them appropriately, then setting the right policies, community policing, engagement with the community, use of force. And then when officers do wrong, we want to have early intervention so that we can redirect them on how to do their jobs properly. And if they can't figure it out, they need to find another job. And we want to make sure that people can't wander from one department to another. But the criminal justice system is more than just that police-citizen engagement. It's things like decriminalizing. Why are we arresting 30,000 people a year for small amounts of marijuana possession? That is a racial equity issue because research shows that black people and white people smoke marijuana at very similar rates. But black people are 3 times more likely.
Does that have to go through the legislature?
That would require a change in law, decriminalization. So we're not trying to make it legal at this point. We want to study legalization. But we want to make sure that we're not clogging up our courts and clogging up our jails and burdening people with criminal records unnecessarily.
Well, as you know, many states have legalized marijuana. Do you see that down the road for North Carolina, or as you say, you have to study it?
I expect that it will come, and that's why I want us to not rush into it. I want to have a process where public safety folks are sitting with public health folks, sitting with community leaders, and we identify, because it's very complicated. It's not only possession, but it's how do you sell it, how do you produce it, and how do you control the chemical composition of it. Because I'm not looking to have a weed shop on every corner. That would not be good for North Carolina at all.
Let me ask you, some people can't pay fines, so the Supreme Court, or is there some rules that tell the other courts how to deal with fines when they can't pay fines?
That is a recommendation we are making. We do not want to criminalize poverty. We want people who go to jail because they deserve it. They did something wrong and they're a threat to public safety, not because they're poor. So there's really 2 ways that comes into play. One is after someone's arrested, but before they've been convicted. Our jails are filled with people who simply can't pay a few $100s bail. Some people are in jail, Mark, for a longer period of time waiting trial than had they been convicted of the charge they were arrested for, the maximum sentence. And we cannot be imprisoning people because they have to be a threat, not because they're poor. And that's true with fines and fees. We want the courts to take into account someone's ability to pay before they levy a fine or a fee.
Josh, how does that work? That's called general practices, right? That goes through the Supreme Court, and then they recommend it all the way down to the lower courts?
That's right. There are a number of recommendations. We ask the Administrative Office of the Court, which is part of the Chief Justice, oversees the Administrative Office of the Court. So we have recommendations for them to adopt, but we also have recommendations to the legislature to revisit some of the fees that are levied on people in the criminal justice system.
Let me ask you, there was a recent Fourth Circuit ruling on voter ID. What's your view of that, and what's next?
Well, what is next is there's going to be a trial. The ruling in the Fourth Circuit had to do with whether the injunction that the federal district court judge put into place last year stood. The Fourth Circuit said no, and now it will go to trial. Really, the injunction at this point is moot because the election is over. There remains an injunction from state court because there were 2 actions, both in state and federal. And so we just have to litigate this. And I'm defending the state in this matter.
Well, let me ask you this. Could it go to the Supreme Court? And isn't there, and I'm jumping around a little bit, there's another lawsuit on this working its way through the courts too as well, correct?
Yeah, there is the case in state court, there's a case in federal court, and at any point it could go up to the United States Supreme Court. But I think at this point, everyone's just going to wait to see how the trial goes and what facts are developed and come out at trial.
So if you were to guess, next election, 2022, will people have to show an ID, or is it that premature?
I think it's premature because we just don't know. I mean, the law is that folks do need to have an ID, but there was not only a federal injunction, there is a remaining state injunction. So we just have to litigate this out and let the courts tell us what the rules are.
You know, there's a lot of talk about fraud in this election. We talked about that off camera. Are mail-in ballots safe, and can people can they believe that our voting system is secure and not fraught with fraud?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, as much attention as was devoted and said about voter fraud and election fraud in this election, if there was any widespread fraud, it would have been uncovered. And it's one thing to tweet about it. It's one thing to make a political speech about it. It's easy to say there's fraud, there's millions of ballots, there's so much criminality. But when you go to court, you can't just talk. You have to actually have evidence. And if you don't have evidence, the court will smack you down. And there was not a single case in which there was evidence brought forward of any fraud that made any impact on any election.
Josh, how do you verify a mail-in ballot, and how do you avoid ballot harvesting like we had down in the 9th Congressional District, where they had to do a redo on the election?
Well, the legislature changed the law, saying that there cannot be ballot harvesting. The only people who can turn in a mail-in ballot in person is the voter or a close family member of the voter. So that is not an issue any longer. The way you can ensure that somebody's not voting twice, voting by mail and voting in person, which unfortunately a couple of people tried to do, is the ballot that's sent to you by mail has a scan code that's connected to you. And if your ballot is accepted, then when you come to vote in person, you will be denied the opportunity to vote. If you vote in person while your ballot is still in the mail, it will show that you've already voted, and that mail-in ballot will be discarded. You cannot vote twice in North Carolina.
Yeah, of course, this was because of the pandemic. Do you see this becoming just a convenient thing to do, and more people voting by absentee and less people showing up on the day of the election?
I think so. I mean, absentee voting by mail has been legal in North Carolina for decades. And it used to be you had to be out of state in order to vote by mail. But maybe 15, 20 years ago, they changed the law so that anyone who wanted to vote by mail could. And hundreds of thousands of people have typically availed themselves of that. The number spiked because of the pandemic. I voted by mail. A lot of people just didn't feel comfortable going to a voting area, and that's totally understandable. But I think that since people have done it and they now know how the system works and they're comfortable with it, they know about how to get a witness and get the signature, and I think a lot more people will continue to vote by mail because of the convenience.
You've been alerting the public about COVID-19 scams. Talk to us about that, sir.
Well, it's just really tragic. I mean, when there is a crisis like COVID-19, you see both sides of humanity. You see the absolute best and you see the absolute worst. We have all these first responders doing everything they can to keep us safe. The public health officials urging us to wear masks and keep distant from each other, trying to save lives. But then you have criminals who come out of the woodwork to exploit people's fear, the uncertainty of the situation. So we've seen all manner of scams, from miracle cures, and of course now the vaccines are out there. Vaccine scams. With the economic impact payments from the government, we see fake emails about that. We see them about the business PPP loans. So basically, anywhere there's money exchanging hands and confusion, the criminals will strike. We also saw price gouging, and I sued a towing company in Charlotte that was putting boots on trucks trying to deliver medical supplies, food and water, really back in April at the height of the crisis. And they were charging outrageous sums, $4,000, to get these trucks back into commerce. I also sued a medical supplier out of New Jersey for charging outrageous prices for face masks, and we reached a $150,000 civil penalty settlement with that company. So My job is to go after the wrongdoers when they try to take advantage of people.
Have you seen a spike since the lockdowns? Have you seen a spike in opioid use and other drugs?
It's terrible. It's tragic because, Mark, we were making real progress in our fight against the opioid epidemic. In 2019, we actually saw the first decline in years in opioid overdose deaths as a result of a lot of people's hard work. It's a project I've been working on since I was elected back in 2016. Because of the pandemic, people are in isolation. They are removed, they lose their jobs, they have financial stress, the depression and anxiety levels are increasing, and so we're seeing a lot more drug use and a lot more opioid overdose deaths, and it breaks my heart.
Well, we've had these lockdowns, and are they enforceable, by the way? Are they enforceable by law? What is that law?
Well, when the governor issues an executive order about wearing masks or the size of a how many people can be in a restaurant or at a gathering. Those are misdemeanors, Class 2 misdemeanors, if you violate them, to be enforced by local law enforcement. But the governor's also encouraging local governments to pass municipal ordinances doing the same things that mirror his executive orders, which can then be enforced by a civil infraction, a ticket, rather than the criminal process. Just like we're trying to do with marijuana decriminalization. It's still wrong, but it's more likely to be enforced if it's civil instead of criminal.
So let me ask you this. Is it more of a county by county thing, you think? Is it really up to the county municipalities?
In terms of enforcement, it's up to the local police departments and local sheriffs. So yes, in that way it is. But the governor's rules apply statewide.
Okay, what new laws will we be looking at in 2021 that you'd like to bring to our attention, sir?
Well, a couple took effect in December. One was the First Step Act, and the other was the Second Chance Act. And I mentioned earlier how criminal justice reform really is an issue where Democrats and Republicans have worked together and can work together. And I commend the Republican legislature for these laws. One has to do with expungements, helping people who had a criminal incident in the past clean their record after
be looking at in 2021 that you'd like to bring to our attention, sir?
Well, a couple took effect in December. One was the First Step Act, and the other was the Second Chance Act. And I mentioned earlier how criminal justice reform really is an issue where Democrats and Republicans have worked together and can work together. And I commend the Republican legislature for these laws. One has to do with expungements, helping people who had a criminal incident in the past clean their record after a few years so that they have a better chance of success down the road. The other has to do with people who use drugs to help them get out of the criminal justice system and get the treatment they need in the healthcare system to be well and, again, to succeed in life. So those are two laws that have taken effect for the new year.
How do people apply for those expungements, and what kind of crimes does that apply for that can be expunged?
They tend to be lower-level crimes, clearly nonviolent crimes. And some of them you have to go through a court process, and what the legislature is trying to do is make a lot of these more automatic so that they just happen as a matter of course.
You know, this time of year, and as we get into the first of the year, we get all these robocalls and different investment scams. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, the robocalls are an incredible scourge. I mean, what an annoyance. But also, the reason they exist isn't to drive us crazy. They exist to steal from vulnerable people. That's why the calls are made. And they work. Predominantly seniors, they steal hundreds of millions of dollars from people. So fighting robocalls has been a priority of mine and will remain a priority of mine. So we just urge people to use their good sense. If somebody's promising you something that's too good to be true, an investment opportunity or a job or anything like that, debt relief, you know, you're in financial crisis, I can make it all go away. If it sounds so good, I assure you it's just not right.
There's a lot of Social Security scams right now, isn't there?
Social Security scams, and as we get into the first quarter, starting to get into tax season, you're going to see tax scams. They will use the government's authority to try to create fear in you, because when you're afraid or anxious or uncertain, that's when you make bad decisions. So if you get into that place where you're feeling agitated and you don't know what's going on, just take a pause. The government is not going to call you to demand money. And if you have any question, I have dedicated professionals at our Consumer Protection Division to help you. 877-5-NO-SCAM. Just call them and ask them, is this legitimate or not? It is so much better to not lose money than to try to get it back.
You know, Mr. Attorney General, every year we talk about this. It's a terrible subject to talk about, but human trafficking, are we making progress in that area in North Carolina?
I hope so. It's really hard to know because this is a crime that exists in the shadows, so that a lot of people who have been victimized, they don't come forward and tell us. And we are one of the leading states in terms of the calls made to the national hotline for human trafficking. And in my view, I want the number of calls to increase, not because that means it's happening more often, but rather it means that more victims feel comfortable reaching out for the help that they need.
You've been pushing to bring down some of these gangs particularly around our urban areas. Talk to us about that.
Well, I mean, the drug crisis it's devastating to people who are addicted because it takes over control of their lives. But then the criminal elements exploit that. I keep talking about how the bad of humanity is driven by greed, and people will do anything to make money, and gangs flourish when there's widespread addiction. And so we need to have a comprehensive strategy, law enforcement strategy. We need to have drug interdiction to stop the drugs coming in. We need to have enforcement against drug dealers and drug traffickers, but we also have to deal with the demand side of the equation, which is people with addiction, and help them overcome their addiction, because if people aren't addicted, then there's no market for these gangs to sell their drugs.
Let me ask you this. We talked about this again off camera. There's a lawsuit going to the Supreme Court, possibly by 17 states trying to overturn the recent presidential election. Does that have merit, my friend?
No, and it doesn't, and it will go nowhere. Here's what's amazing about this country. We have been a democracy for a longer period of time than any other nation in the world. Over 200 years, 220 years, and we've had something like 23 peaceful transfers of power, where the losing side hands over the keys to the White House to the winning side. And we've done that with grace throughout our history. This race was not even close. It was a 7 million vote margin. The Electoral College was 306. It was not a close election, but because the president is unwilling to accept the verdict of the voters, he's spewing a lot of misinformation and claims that have no validity. And sadly, a number of Republican elected officials are getting in behind him. And I'm quite disappointed at my colleagues from across the country.
You know, there's a protocol to that where the first families get together for lunch. That's not going to happen. It's my understanding that he's not going to the inauguration. And as far as I can see, the only time that happened in our history before is when Adams didn't go to Jefferson's inauguration. Can you talk to us about the data breach at Home Depot and the lawsuit?
Yeah, there was a data breach at Home Depot. There was one a couple months, another settlement with Anthem Healthcare. Basically, these massive companies have incredible amounts of personal information data of ours. And it is imperative when the companies, and frankly the government, when they have all this information, that they safeguard that information, because it is worth a ton to criminals. And both of those companies, Home Depot and Anthem, had these breaches and failed to have done what they should have done. So we reached a settlement with them whereby they have agreed to make substantial changes to their security systems to reduce the likelihood of these kind of breaches ever occurring again with them. And every year we do a report on the number of security breaches that happened that year, and in the coming weeks we will be issuing the one for 2020. In 2019, there were more security breaches reported to our office, well over 1,000, than had ever been reported in the past.
Josh, what are your top priorities for 2021?
Well, I want to make sure that we protect the people of North Carolina. That's what the job of Attorney General is. Want to keep folks safe from crime by promoting public safety. We've got this task force report that we've issued to the governor. We now have to work to implement all of these ideas so that our criminal justice system works better and treats people more fairly. I'm continuing my work to tackle the opioid epidemic that's devastating families across North Carolina. I want to protect seniors and consumers, fighting robocallers, making sure that the big tech companies don't exploit their massive power in the economy and over our lives in a way that hurts us. And I will go to court to stand up for consumers. I continue to protect kids from e-cigarette manufacturer Juul. I sued Juul and have a trial date early this year to hold them accountable for their practices, addicting another generation of kids. And I want to make sure that the drinking water across North Carolina is clean. I sued DuPont and Chemours for discharging a chemical called PFAS, a forever chemical, into the Cape Fear River.
Let me ask you this. You think you'll find common ground on criminal justice reform with the General Assembly, the Republicans in the General Assembly?
I sure hope so. We've had great success in recent years. That we worked together on opioids, passing the STOP Act and the HOPE Act and Synthetic Opioid Control Act. We've worked together to protect kids from child sex abusers with the Safe Child Act. They've done reforms like the First Step and Second Chance Act. So I'm genuinely hopeful and look forward to engaging the legislature in a way to make our criminal justice system better.
Josh, how can they get in touch with you, our viewers? How can they, your website, please, sir?
Yeah, ncdoj.gov. It has any kind of consumer tip you could possibly have, complaint forms if you need to file a complaint with my office.
Josh, thanks for being with us. That's it for us. Have a great new year. See you next week on Front Row.